Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Lowell Bergman, who is an award-winning reporter, producer, and journalism consultant, and who teaches in the journalism school at UC Berkeley. He was a founder of the Center for Investigative Journalism and for the Investigative Reporters and Editors Group, which was formed in the aftermath of a slaying of a Arizona journalist. For more than 30 years, he has worked in print and television, first in the alternative press at the San Diego Free Press, which became the San Diego Street Journal, then at ABC News, and finally at CBS, where he was a producer for the television program 60 Minutes for 60 years. Mr. Bergman's reports regularly made news on subjects like the California prison system, Saddam Hussein's money, the tobacco industry, the international arms business, and the first television interviews with Lebanon's Hezbollah. The story of his fight to expose the tobacco industry and to protect his sources, to keep his word to a tobacco whistleblower, is chronicled in the Abbey Mann movie, The Insider.
Oh, Michael Mann.
Michael Mann movie, The Insider, in which he is portrayed by Al Pacino. Lowell Bergman is the winner of numerous awards, including the George Forster Peabody Award, numerous Emmys, and the Alfred I. DuPont Gold Baton Award. Lowell, good to have you for our program. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in New York City and didn't leave the city limits basically until I was 17.
And how did your parents shape your character, do you think, in retrospect?
How did my parents shape my character? Well, that's, we could be here all day. I mean, my family is basically Eastern European on my mother's side, immigrants, Jewish immigrants who came over at the turn of the century. My father, who passed away a year and a half ago, came from Hungary in 1938, first to Cuba and then into the United States. And so I lived in that I grew up in that post-World War II era when there were both members of the family who never made it out of Europe, plus a lot of, on my mother's side, I would say a left political perspective. I can still remember the FBI coming to the house in 1951 to ask my mother about having been in the Young Communist League, and then coming back to interview my father, who was then in the fur business, about his partnerships with people in the mafia.
Colorful background, and rich one. And your grandmother was a founder of the Women's Garment Union?
No, my grandmother and grandfather were founders of the ILGW in New York that was embroidery workers. So she was the first secretary treasurer, and there's a sort of family picture of her with like 18 men, my grandfather being one of them, and she's the only female. It was mostly women workers, but the leadership was always men, except for her.
And so I presume in this background that politics was talked a lot about at the dinner table?
Well, growing up with my father was gone by the time I was 7. Mm-hmm. Came back off and on, basically went back to Europe in the late 50s permanently. Mm-hmm. There was political conversation primarily with my grandparents, who might have up on their wall a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, Lenin, and a wide variety of other characters.
And did you...
Emma Goldman was a big, it was somebody everyone talked about because they remembered her from Union Square in New York, and that she had a little woman who had a voice you could hear without an amplifier.
And were there war stories that you heard from your grandmother, so to speak, from the labor union organizing days? Or?
Well, there were war stories from the labor union organizing days, but primarily I think the things that made an impression on me was the struggle to come over from Europe. Mm-hmm. Poverty, particularly the role of women, the plight of, like, she was a middle daughter in a family that couldn't afford the 10 children they had. Mm-hmm. So she was basically a serf to an older uncle who was ill, who she had to take care of.
In Europe?
In Europe, before she came over.
And she came over when?
She came over about 1906. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather came over, my mother's side came over about 1904. Mm-hmm. And worked from the time they arrived. My grandfather's great influence was that despite the fact that he was stuck in this position, he was really an artist and was the guy who designed the embroidery, right? And spent his whole life really always running off to, you could find him cutting out, doing paper cutouts or whatever. So for a kid growing up, he was a good example of that you didn't have to work hard all the time. And it really was a matriarchy. The women were the tough guys. My mother's like a force to be reckoned with at 82.
And do you remember any books that you read when you were a young person that really influenced you, or did that have to wait until you were an undergraduate and graduate student?
I really liked, for purposes of getting through public school, I really liked classic illustrated comics. Saved me a lot of time.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and it got you interested in those visual images,
Yeah, right.
right?
Actually, I'm still talking to people about the next great project for me that I would like to do is an animated documentary.
Well, you might get a bigger audience in that way.
You don't have to deal with talent that way.
That's right. And you were on the school newspaper in high school, I don't know, you were a typographer?
No, I worked, I had various jobs growing up, and after working in a boatyard near the Whitestone Bridge, through my mother remarried, and through my stepfather, he had an uncle who owned a typography shop on 45th and 45th Street, and right across from the old Daily Mirror. It was on the 9th floor, and this was considered maybe a ticket to a better life, because typographers were seen as, in a sense, the intellectuals of the labor movement. It was a good-paying job. So I was an apprentice, but my job was to come in. These were the days before the shops were air-conditioned. So I spent the mornings cleaning the floor, cleaning the linotype machines, straining the lead, doing a lot of stuff with zinc and lead, which today would probably be illegal, and and slowly learning the trade. It was a toss-up between doing that, especially when they told me if I became a journeyman, right? They covered everything, including your funeral.
That was utopia.
Yeah.
But then you went on to do undergraduate work at Wisconsin.
Well, I got a scholarship to go to the University of Wisconsin, and I'd met some people the summer before, in 1963. I graduated high school in '63, and I got shipped off to Puerto Rico for an Alliance for Progress meeting of youth, and I met a couple of guys from the U.S. who were there as well, and who were telling me Wisconsin was a great place, because I'd never crossed the Hudson River except for a couple of times to go to Philadelphia to a Seder. So I had no idea what really the rest of the world was like.
And that was the 60s, really.
That's 63.
And you got involved, I guess, as a student in civil rights and anti-war activity?
Yeah, I got attracted to the anti-war movement, actually, or the nuclear, the ban the bomb sort of movement in high school, because it just logically made sense to me. I grew up in the era when you would have air raid drills in elementary school, and you got on your desk. And somebody actually got me a copy, I can't remember whom, of the original Port Huron statement for SDS, which is really a statement about contradictions, which made a big impression on me, because you could see that everything from sex to, to politics, that there was all these contradictory things going on, and you were looking for a way to express it. And then, of course, I got involved in this Turn Towards Peace demonstration, I remember, and they put me on a bus at Columbia University, and I was like the bus monitor. I was about 17, and we went up to, I think it was Sarah Lawrence College, and picked up a busload of young women, all with funny names. They were like Sunflower and this and that, all of whom were quite attractive. And I said, well, this may be for me.
I see. I see. So it's high school kids today might not really have a sense of what the 60s and that experience meant for that generation. So I'm curious, what in retrospect was distinctive and lasting for you about that generation?
In the whole...
Yeah, the whole Megillah.
The whole Megillah?
Yeah.
Well, I think a combination of things. One was that it was, to me, and always stayed the same, was that it was an attempt to look for the truth that you knew and felt versus what you were told. So if the U.S. was the defender of democracy, how come there was apartheid basically in the United States? If we were the peace-loving country, why were we early in the 60s bombing Laos or Vietnam, or then there was the Dominican Republic, invading places and so on? And it's those kinds of stark contrasts that people like myself, I think, were working out during this period of time. Also, coming from sort of a working class background, or lower middle class, if you will, background, I was always had that, and I still do, have that depression fear of never working again. So if someone offered you a job, you took it, right? So the whole idea of dropping out, of stopping doing what you were sort of on a track to do, which I saw a lot of people do before I did it in, let's say, late 68, early 69, where I finally cut my institutional ties, was a major thing for me to do. I mean, and it gave me the strength, to a certain extent, to do that without destroying myself in the process. I'm not talking about, a lot of people dropped out, got hurt, or didn't follow through, but there seemed to be a way to balance what was going on.
And these contradictions, this harkens back to what you were saying about the Port Huron statement, because it was a document that was putting this down on paper, these kinds of contradictions. So you were at Wisconsin and then at UC San Diego, you were really drawn to theory, to political philosophy. Why, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, I was an academic. I was at the University of Wisconsin. We did get heavily involved, for instance, in the South, in the preparations for what became Freedom Summer. I did a bunch of trips down, was involved in the logistics to help set it up, and had been through that process. Just the contradictions in that were interesting to me. But the bigger questions, and I remember Wisconsin in those days had a small magazine called Studies on the Left. And there was an unusual agglomeration of faculty. There was a guy named William Appleman Williams, who was in the history department. There was a guy named George Mossey in history, who I worked for a while, and Hans Gerth in sociology. And you could, through them and what they had written or what they were lecturing about, and a history professor named Harvey Goldberg, who did the history of the French Revolution almost every other semester, I'm talking about classes with 400 and 500 people in them, great lectures. There was a sense of trying to learn about ideas, and that ideas would help you understand what to do. And clearly Marxist theory, as well as standard capitalist theory, neither seemed to be adequate, neither seemed to be fruitful in terms of really understanding what you wanted the world to be or how you wanted to live. And so it was in that effort, and a lot of which I learned through Hans Gerth, who had translated all of Max Weber and had introduced me to people like Lukács, that he said, go study with Marcuse, who I had never heard of.
And Marcuse was a German philosopher who had immigrated to the United States, was associated with the Frankfurt School, and then had been at Brandeis, and then was now at UC San Diego.
Well, I mean, Gerth, Mossey, Marcuse, all of these guys were part of the German emigre, from one point or another, movement of academics who came over to the United States. And I got fascinated with that worldview, which had a deep sense of history and an attempt to integrate everything from Plato to modern political activity.
Now, it's always an interesting question what we get out of our education, and I get the sense in reading about you and watching some of your work that theory, and especially the writings of Marcuse, and I saw reference to C. Wright Mills and Hans Gerth, that they were especially important in providing a compass for locating your work in journalism, for later in your career, for locating what's important and what is not. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it for a minute and think about the amount of work that goes into, let's say, an so-called investigative story. I hate using the word because the word doesn't mean that much anymore. But a story that's, let's say, involves real reporting that tries to get to the root of a problem and looks beyond the appearances in the traditional philosophical sense, then you're looking for some truths there that you can present, and looking for them without necessarily prejudice. But you do need to have some guide some way to discern what's important and what's not. And in that sense, my studies back then, my contact with a lot of these people was very important. It's also very practical. I'll give you an example. It was through hanging out with Hans Goethe and reading about bureaucracy and Max Weber that when I finally went to work for a regular large institution, ABC News to begin with, and then CBS, I realized that the key to my freedom was to make sure that I didn't show up in the bureaucracy. So I never had an office, I never had an extension, and I never appeared in the directory.
Now, another thing you seem to have gotten from Goethe is a sense of what is a criminal organization, basically. What is what is the differences between a legitimate and an illegitimate organization in society's eyes? Is that fair?
Some of that came from him. He also, not just organizations, but activity.
Yeah,
in other words,
yeah.
I remember with him in Lukács, there's an essay on what is legal and what is legality and illegality, right? And so it's to have sort of a historical social perspective on what organizations are legitimate and are not. To read the history of capitalism, then you understand that capitalism was an illegal organization, basically, in a feudal society. And so to get a sort of juxtaposed view of that, and then at the same time to understand on a practical level that it's in that world where money and the law meet, that you can often get a really good insight into how things work.
And one of your rules of thumb, I gather, is to follow the money as you do these projects.
I mean, that's the line that was made up in All the President's Men. But it's actually a fictional line.
Okay.
But
it can still guide action, I guess. That's right.
Yeah, well, follow the money is an obvious thing to do if you're talking about certain kinds of activity. But I'd look at it in a different way. If you're looking at why do people do things, particularly on an institutional level, then understanding how the finances work and who's making money off of it, for instance, who's profiting from it, can be critical.
Now, let's talk a minute about Marcuse, because at the time that you studied on him in San Diego, he had become a very controversial figure because his name was being shouted by demonstrators all over the world. But he had thoughts about what a new political theory would be like that could guide action. And one of his foci became really the culture and the media, and how we could have things that he called repressive tolerance, basically, apparent freedom, but not the access to the information that would really educate and inform a citizenry. Talk about that a minute and what impact that thinking had on you.
I first went to study with him in '66, so he was just on the cusp of becoming like a sort of cult hero of the European left or New Left. So it's interesting, and his behavior and what was going on changed as he became more of a public figure. First of all, he presented the most radical idea that he presented was that if you don't know why you're doing something, then why do it? In other words, his greatest criticism of a lot of what went on, including anti-war stuff or political protest, is that people were doing it simply for the action, but didn't really, for the practice, if you will, but didn't understand where they were going or where they were headed, and that his perspective was you had to understand that now and try to understand it in an independent way. I mean, I'm not sure that he was that useful once you decided to do something. But what he did obviously understand was that there is this appearance of freedom, and I just ran into it and run into it today. I mean, I went back to read some Marcuse because I was trying to make some sense for some students of my own about the recent election. Two candidates running for the highest office in the world, if not the nation. Everyone's saying, well, there isn't that much that separates the two of them, so it's the appearance of choice, right? They have the election. The guy with the most votes loses. The media, which says it's in competition with each other and it's a competitive news organizations and so on, it's revealed that their source of information is exactly the same company, exactly the same source. So it was the appearance of competition on the air, the appearance of freedom of the press. Okay, in an election where people did not talk about the substantive issues, neither personally. Both men have admitted that they've had substance abuse problems of different kinds. They never talk about that, and the issues surrounding it, like the whole drug war, didn't come up except until our documentary ran. They didn't talk about it, basically. They didn't even talk about tobacco, and which you thought Gore might have raised, at least because Philip Morris and the tobacco industry were backing Bush. Didn't say a word.
Right.
So that's where Marcuse comes in. It is a way to try to understand, or at least put in some perspective, how we got here to this apparent democracy, appearance of freedom that doesn't have substance.
I found two quotes from a pamphlet or a small book, a monograph that he wrote when he left Brandeis. And he says, under the rule of monopolistic media, themselves the mere instruments of economic and political power, a mentality is created for which right and wrong, true and false, are predefined wherever they affect the vital interests of the society. And then he goes on to say, the avenues of entrance are closed to the meaning of words and ideas other than the established one, established by the publicity of the powers that be and verified in their practice. So what does a reporter like you do in his work? I know you're fascinated by finding, piercing the veil of power that's unaccounted for. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a traditional role, I mean, or definition of, let's say, from muckraking on in the last 100 years of reporting. You know, Marcuse isn't necessarily right.
He is not.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I've flip-flopped back and forth. What I like about him, or when he was alive, especially when I wasn't a student, is that you could sort of have a repartee with him about, this is theory that he's expounding.
Right,
he's trying to find a path. And my example is that one of the reasons I stopped studying with him is that there was an attempt to fire him at the university because of the publicity. There was a constant drumbeat in the local media in San Diego to do that. Governor of California, Reagan, was after him. Shock, Angela Davis was a student of his, and that added to it, you know, communist, blah, blah, et cetera. And so we started a small newspaper in San Diego, mostly ex-students of his and others. And in the end, although it was quite a struggle and lasted for 3 years, by simply publishing what was on the public record in most cases and learning how to get more, things changed or appeared to change in San Diego. In other words, there was a shift, a movement because of information. So the information seemed to me at that point, on both a practical level, in terms of my own survival, I didn't wind up in prison as many people would have predicted in that period of time, and the people we were doing stories about did. So there's, in Marcuse's sense, we were just the appearance of freedom. I don't know. You know,
well,
it did have some leverage or
in
effect.
quoting Marcuse, I hope to suggest that you actually saw. Move beyond his point in a way, that in fact, as I look at your work, it seems to me that you have found points of interest to getting information out that can be useful for people who want to change things. Well,
and I think that philosophically and legally, the society is based on the idea that we have equal protection under the law, or that we're a society of laws. And if you take that to if you use that point, then you can take reporting, for instance, that would in many ways be seen as radical or subversive, and it becomes part of the system by just simply insisting on equal protection or equal application of the law.
So, and in that way, change things.
And that way you'll see reaction, not all the time, but that way the established media will also accept the story. So you have to know what the rules of the game are, right, in order to get the story in there. I mean, the best example I have recently is Marie Brenner, who writes for Vanity Fair. Just did a long piece. It's in the current issue.
Yes, I read it.
Okay, on the Fanjul brothers, right?
Who are Cubans, sugar owners.
Kings, or emperors of, you know, and so on.
Of sugar in Florida.
Right,
places,
and one would not think of such a story being in Vanity Fair.
Right.
And the way she got it in, because I was joking with her the other day, and it's
Yeah.
true, is she quotes the part of the special prosecutor's report on Monica Lewinsky, where Monica Lewinsky says she's performing oral sex on the president when the phone rings, and he said the Fangeli brother just called. Well, it's the Faneuil brother. And then why would he, as the next comment in the article is, what would interrupt the president during a blowjob, right? Well, these super rich guys in Cuba. I mean, Cuban Americans in Miami.
Right, who were heavy contributors to both the Democratic...
And then she can use that opening
Right.
to tell the rest of the story, which becomes a very serious story about exploitation and labor and power and money and wealth
and the way, and by the way, the way the parties don't make a difference in terms of these issues of migrant workers in the she also, we should mention, by the way, wrote the Vanity Fair article on the
tobacco
CBS tobacco
Insider,
and which became the basis of the screenplay. I'm going to quote you from your syllabus. That the course you're now teaching at Berkeley. You say that the course will be about how to find and develop stories that challenge institutions and individuals who wield unaccountable power. It is the kind of reporting that has consequences. While it can bring about change through exposure, it can also lead to trouble. What did you mean by that?
Exactly what it says.
Right. So what does it take?
And you better expect there's going to be some trouble,
that's right.
too.
So okay, you have this theoretical background, which seems to help you see both how to operate in the organizations that you work in. You're describing the bureaucracy at ABC, but on the other hand, points of interest in the stories that you might do.
Well, points where you can put your energy and try to find out things, and sometimes you're not successful, that will help tell a story that hopefully you'll be happy with, and you won't find it embarrassing. You know. Right. So, for example, it would be unlikely that I would do a story about a person who's a welfare cheat, unless this involves like a large amount of money and is something where there's a tremendous amount of profit involved.
Right. Psychologically, what does it take to do the kind of work that you do, the kind of work that is chronicled in the movie The Insider, where Al Pacino plays you? A lot of risk. I mean, you must have courage to do this kind of work.
Well, I don't know. It depends on the subject. I mean, generally speaking, you learn after a while what the limits are and when it's worth taking a risk. For example, I don't do stories about cult groups. And all those cult groups out there who might see that, it won't be me who's around. And that's because I've decided that the motivation of the people involved is closer to sort of blind religion than it is something that I'm ever going to have any influence over, or that I could tell what their reaction may be. Because the risk really is in the reaction. You want to be able to assess what the subject of the story, should they find it uncomfortable or threatening what you're doing, what they might do in return. The other funny part, which I had a hard time convincing the director and the screenwriter of for the movie, because they kept asking me, well, what's the secret of getting people to talk? I mean, what are your tricks? And they would give me some example from the Woodward and Bernstein movie, All the President's Men, or something like that. I said the trick for me, and actually other reporters have come up to me and said they were relieved to see it in the movie, is to tell the truth. That the way to reduce risk is for people to know exactly what you're up to and not be surprised by what you're trying to do. So whether it's the Hezbollah, I mean, you have to do a lot of planning, and you have to do a lot of, let's say, secondary backup preparation. You have to get out fast or something like that. But the basic trick is not to deceive people.
But let's talk a little about this. When you come to an interview situation, you have to come with some sort of a map of where this person fits in to the story that you want to tell. How do you come by that? Through research? Through what you've already studied? Or through other contacts?
Well, I mean, all depends. I mean, if it's somebody who is going to talk to you, and if they say anything to you, it's extremely risky or it's illegal for them to talk to you, then it's a question of usually of bona fides, that is, getting other people to call in advance and say you can trust this person, and or, as I tell students, learn as much about the subject before you get there, depending on whether you play dumb because you want them to explain it to you, or whether you just know that you're not going to waste their time. There's nothing like preparation in any of these situations. But I mean, it would all depend upon what function you see the person playing in the story. Is it a print story? Is it a television story? Is it a documentary? Is it a magazine show? You know, when you get into the area of the magazine show, like 60 Minutes or something like that, then we're talking about a defined. For instance, if I had not studied what I had studied, I would not have been able to understand what I did at the networks in the sense of the forms that are created. It's an area where the form defines a lot of the content. So it's not a situation where they tell you you can't do this story. That's happened a couple of times, but it's rare. It's where either the form itself makes it difficult to tell the story, or they just say, well, it doesn't fit in the form.
Explain to me what you mean by the form. In other words, that you're actually going to tape an interview that is going to be shown on television as is? Is that what you mean by the form? Or?
I mean that if you're working for 60 Minutes and you can't get a correspondent, an on-camera personality, let's say, in the other chair with the person being interviewed, and it could be the greatest interview potential in the world, you can't do it.
I see.
So the form of the program, the storytelling form of the program, defines what interview you can do on camera, okay? I might be able to do 100 other interviews leading up to the on-camera interview without the on-camera person. Or I might be able to do some of the minor interviews that, you know, just help inform the show and videotape those or film them in the old days and insert that somewhere in the story. But an example in the Hezbollah story, we spent some time in Baalbek, which in northern Lebanon, which is considered the world headquarters of both terrorism and counterfeiting and a big drug nexus. And we almost got killed. I mean, just because of the certain things you couldn't plan for. 2 camera crews, myself, and my old friend Jim Hogan, and running around. Now, Mike Wallace never made it there. He was, and the funny story to me, to give you the form, is the executive producer said to me when I came back, what should we call this story? Which is about to go on the air. And I said, about Hezbollah. No. How about terrorists? No. He said, how long were you there? And I said, oh, I was there like 14 days, and I knew what was coming. And I said, and I went to Baalbek, and I almost got killed, and we got chased around, and we have all this footage. The footage is not in the show. The reason it wasn't in the show is Mike wasn't there, and et cetera. And he says, no, you don't understand. Nobody cares about you. How long was Mike there? 3 days. Title, 3 days in Beirut. So the form, structural form defines the content.
So as a producer of these segments on 60 Minutes, what you had control of was limited in a way, because you're saying that the executive producer was really your boss, basically.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. So then what is your role to really get as much of the truth as is showable, presentable, or airable? Is that the answer?
Well, I mean, but you have as presentable, as, you know, showable, as, well, there are certain definitions of what that is. If I, after a while, because they came to trust me, because I internalized the form, I knew that, you know, it has to be done this way. I knew that actually. I learned that at ABC. It's the same form at ABC. It's slightly looser, but it's a form that's been created over the last, it'll be now almost half century. Don Hewitt, the executive producer of 60 Minutes, was one of the creators of that form, or he adopted pieces of it as he saw it along the way. It's the form that we in the United States have come to understand when we watch television and get information from television. And when it's not in that form, we either get confused or bored. And so it's the form that you have to work inside of. It involves everything from the correspondent being on camera and the characterization of the correspondent. They never lose an argument. They never mispronounce a word. They appear to be the reporter. You never see any of the other people around. Occasionally you do, and that's a big revelation when they show that. You know, because we sat down with so-and-so, and you can see some of the lights or something around. So the audience knows that there are other people involved, just like when you go to the movies. But that's what it is. It's a movie. It's a movie within a certain form. And that limits what you learn about. You don't, I mean, Hewitt's been upfront about it. He won't put anybody on camera who says axed.
Axed means?
Ask, you know, meaning any black person who speaks inner city lingo.
I see.
Because they're hard to understand, and 60 Minutes is based as a show form on the audio, actually, interestingly enough, that you can follow the whole thing by listening to it. You don't necessarily have to look at the pictures. It's a small screen format in that sense, going back to the 60s, and rarely with any subtitles, never any chyrons. You know, and everyone's always ID'd verbally. So it's a form that a story, and this form is never explained to the audience.
Right.
You don't learn it in school. They won't tell you about it. I've tried to get them to do it.
Right. And you call this the grammar of television, right? Right. Yeah. So why won't they do it? Because it then suggests, well, this isn't really the whole truth. What are they
afraid of? This is one of the most sophisticated forms of propaganda that's ever been developed. It uses all the film techniques that were first introduced by Leni Riefenstahl and in the 30s for the Nazis, combined with the best of Hollywood manufacturing of the star, and combines that with what appears to be nonfiction information. And it is, again, it's what you expect. If you go to Britain, although they are changing their news format, but most other countries, for instance, 60 Minutes has very little overseas sales. Documentaries for PBS that are produced, let's say, with Bill Moyers in it, for overseas sales, they have to recut it and take Bill Moyers out because the other societies don't know who these storytellers are. Not that I'd put Bill on the same scale with some of the network television people, but so it's a form that we have internalized that you have to work inside of if that's the place you want to work.
Now, so what is the consequences of this? First, I'm fairly informed. This is somewhat surprising. I haven't taken a journalism course. I haven't.
It's not even taught in most journalism schools.
Well, that's but
or questioned.
Okay, so this sounds pretty. It takes one aback because it suggests that the truth is really the orange is really being squeezed through a very fine strainer, or not so.
Well, they would say, well, this is a storytelling technique, and it works, and it does. It's very effective.
But it works. Why? Because things change? Because you get big audiences, or what?
It makes it easier for you to understand a story. There's not there is, for example, in the style of 60 Minutes, rarely any history in a story. You will rarely see like old footage or a section that explains the history of the story you're about to see. So history, in a sense, stands still. Time stands still. There are a lot of, that may not be true at NBC. Dateline sometimes, for instance, is a magazine format. We'll show you some older footage, and so will ABC. Different operations have different forms. But this becomes a way of identifying both the information and the programming and tuning in again. It's comfortable. You watch at 7 o'clock on Sundays, and you get your 3 pieces of, quote, real information.
And so why don't journalism schools teach this? Because it's shop business. You have to go to the
well, they'll teach you. They may teach you how to be an on-camera person, in your documentary film or television program, and they may teach you some aspects of it. But it's never discussed as what does this really mean in terms of the content or real life or what we really know is true. And it's never revealed by the makers of it. They won't tell you why, but I've been, my brief tenure at ABC, I was there 5.5 years. I played executive. I did move to New York for a while, the only time I ever did that. And I proposed it a number of times, and it just, their eyes glaze over and they roll their eyes. Oh, everyone knows. But not everyone knows, or they think they know. They think it's a Diane Sawyer story, or they think that's how they talk about it, right? So as a producer, if you're doing real reporting for one of these shows, one of the first things you have to realize is that it's going to be called somebody else's story, which friends of mine in print, when I first got into television, first number of years I was in television, used to ask me, how can you stand that, not having a byline? Because, you know, at the New York Times, they'll kill each other for a byline.
Right, right. So how do you deal with these frustrations? I mean, it must be frustrating.
So I got some of them out in the movie.
I see. But I'm curious because as I walk you through this story, which is your story, you know, when Marcuse, the '60s, passion, but then as now we're talking about this, it's a very rationalized system in which your product. That is, it's rationalized by the people who want only certain information out.
They wouldn't say that. They want their information out so that people will watch it, they'll say.
Right, okay. But all right, so is it frustrating for somebody like you, or do you adjust over time to the system?
Well, you adjust, you learn the system, you know. I mean, you could turn it back, you know, Marcuse used to say, decided that the way to go was the long march through the institution, you know, as opposed to dropping out.
That's
you know.
right.
You know, to me, on occasion, it did allow me to reach a large audience, the largest audience you can reach in the United States, basically, with stories and information that wouldn't have come out otherwise, or I thought wouldn't come out otherwise, or had some effect because of the size of the audience. Now, that's limited in the sense that, I'll give you an example, a very simple example. I knew going in, for instance, after having been at ABC and seeing what I had seen at 60 Minutes, didn't take me long, you're not going to be able to do a story, for instance, about the owner of an NFL team, a football team, a multimillionaire, a billionaire. That's enterprise reporting that covers new things or, quote, wrongdoing, right? Because it's not going to happen on network television, right? Aside, whatever the form is, right? Whatever the form is for, given the form, a multimillionaire, someone on the Forbes list who appears on 60 Minutes is not going to get roughed up. It doesn't matter what the form is, that's just not going to happen, right? And there aren't really any exceptions. They've come every time they've heard me say this, they come up with some example, you know, about Nike or something. But it's like the exception proves the rule. I mean, you know, they're very, very few and far between when any of these programs take on individuals or institutions their own size, particularly in the private sector.
Well, in light of what you've just described, this grammar of television. Marie Brenner, in her Vanity Fair story on which led to the movie The Insider, refers to the long dance to win trust, you to win Wygant's trust. So what is involved in that process? I mean, obviously you don't discuss what we just discussed. That is, oh, by the way, remember we're going to be doing this through the form, right?
No. From his point of view, being an average person, you know, middle-class person, 60 Minutes, so that's prestige, that's power, so it's useful in terms of getting him to possibly cooperate. You know, you're not from whatever, something you hadn't heard of, or Dateline, or some show that wouldn't necessarily elicit the same level of sort of prestige, okay, or clout, right? So therefore, you use that to help your discussion. And frankly, 60 Minutes not only has almost basically unlimited resources, but within the CBS News organization in particular, there was, quote, a tradition of doing things, standards and practices and so on, which both the institution, at least verbally and in many ways in reality, maintained, and to which you could go to people inside the institution, and I'm thinking in particular to lawyers who work with us all the time there, but a number of people to elicit that tradition. Then if you followed those rules, if you knew what they were supposed to stand up as an institution and back what you were doing, right? So I had internalized this as a process. So from the very beginning with Wigand, for instance, it's not shown so much in the movie, I had informed all the powers that be of exactly what I was doing. Why? Because you've never seen a fiduciary officer of a Fortune 500 company appear on camera and sort of tell what he knows, particularly if it's of interest to the public health and not particularly helpful to his former employer. It just hasn't happened. So it was unique enough in that sense.
I'm curious, I can't help asking you what the impact of these different formats are. Let me have this introduction to the question. Your story with regard to tobacco was told in a major movie. You were played by Al Pacino. You have just done a 4-hour documentary on the drug wars, which you are part of a team, but the main reporter for. And there is a popular movie out now called Traffic. I wonder if you could assess for us the impact of different media for getting the story out. Do you have a sense of that?
In part. I mean, I don't think I have an organized theory that it all fits in. I can only talk about motivation and what I observe personally. In the case of The Insider, the movie about the tobacco story, that came about in part because, the movie came about in part because the nature of what I was doing in an effort to get the story out, but also to protect Wigand, the source, my relationship with CBS changed. I went from becoming someone who basically followed the rules. I didn't talk to people on the outside about what was going on, or et cetera, because in my opinion, the company abandoned the last line, and my colleagues abandoned the last line of, let's say, standards that I thought they would keep. And also, it began to get close to the edge of violating a promise I made to myself when I got into network news back in '78, which was I was going to get out of this business with my name intact. That somehow or another, whether they assigned me or whatever, I would either get a story killed. I was not going to be associated with something that, personally, that I did not agree with. I mean, I couldn't control the institution, but I could use whatever effort I could to control what I got involved in or did. So if I had gone along with them on a personal level, I would have been over the line. The reality was things through circumstances or whatever worked out that the story ran. But in the aftermath of the story, the spin, which my colleagues are just masters at, was that, oh, this is an anomaly, this has never happened before, we got it on the air in the end, and so it was a tough thing, but now everything's okay and it won't happen again.
We should explain that the corporate pressure was placed on the news division to essentially kill the story, and in the background is a major financial transaction involving the owners of CBS.
But it's more than just killing the story. I was ordered not to have any more contact with this guy, not to help him, cut him and his family loose, okay? So it was more than just, okay, the company says I can't run it, sorry, see you some other day. This guy's hanging out there. He's,
okay.
They said, well, what if he gets sued because of what he did that we asked him to do? Leave him alone. Don't touch him. That was the line I was unwilling to go along with. The upshot is that after it was all over and they were spinning it, I was not willing to let it rest in the sense that, oh, this will go away and then it'll never happen again. Bullshit. First of all, it had happened before. It just had not happened involving somebody who was relatively helpless. And secondly, I could go off and write a book about it, or I could go off at some point and write a journalism school article, in some Columbia Journalism Review, but the general audience wouldn't get the idea. I mean, the whole reason for someone like myself to be involved, I'm just in something like 60 Minutes, with all the frustrations and problems, is you get what do they offer you? This giant audience that you can get a little bit of information to that you think is important. That's the really bottom line professional attraction. They pay well, but the money, I'm telling you, is not necessarily makes up for the heart attacks that people have who work there. The fact was that I felt that there had to be some way to lay out exactly what really went on here in some way, and I think the movie captures a large part of that. I, being inside the story and into nonfiction, would have had a lot more detail about a lot of other things, but I think people got the point. And
when push comes to shove, in a way, in the story, you become a whistleblower, in a way, in the way that Wigand was a whistleblower, and both of you are sort of bothered about the full implications of what you're being asked to do.
Well, no question, but I mean, the difference with me would be, I suppose, from Wigand, is that I had been in the business a long time. I knew who I was dealing with. I had been around other situations. I had seen what they do to people. And I had a large network of, if you will, sources and friends, and I decided to put that to work to make this come out, and hopefully I would survive and he would survive. Because the problem with most whistleblower scenarios is that the people get so deeply involved, like himself, like Wigand, that they get beyond the point where they can control events, and that's when they become vulnerable.
I'm curious, when you look in the mirror, do you see Al Pacino?
No, luckily for me, or unluckily for me, you know, I just see somebody over 55 who's getting older.
I see.
And I mean, I suppose if I were a lot younger, I could make, you know, it would have screwed me up in, I think, in some ego way. But I think the bottom line is Al Pacino, brilliant actor. It was a wonderful thing to have him chosen to play me. But he's older than I am. He's Italian and he's a little shorter.
But you think he did a good job?
I think he's a great actor. I mean, it's for me to assess it, frankly, it's very difficult because I'm so close to it. I think what Russell Crowe did, playing Wigand, was really the payoff for me. And Christopher Plummer's mannerisms as Mike Wallace were dynamite. But I got a good chuckle out of that.
A final question. What lessons might students draw from this journey that we just described, from a passionate graduate student to CBS producer? Any special insights you would like to leave us with?
Well, the most important thing that I learned in this process, I think, in terms of dealing with people, is, and you said it earlier about the narcs and the drug wars thing, you didn't expect them to be smart, is that everyone has their set of reasons. There are smart narcs, as for example. There are brilliant drug dealers. Everyone's a human being. I remember, I'll leave you this thought, you know, and that is that I was giving my deposition once in a lawsuit involving the owners of a company that sued me and my colleague for $630 million because we said that they were connected to organized crime. And one of the lawyers said, well, he's never killed anybody. And I said, well, not that we can prove. And did he ever threaten you? I said, no, he was a really nice guy. So everybody can be super nice, great human beings within their context of the world that they live in. But, and it's important to step back and objectively look at where other people are coming from and where they fit into the world in general before you make great judgments.
And from what you said before, it's really understanding that institutional background and setting, the constraints, the incentives, the motives that drive people, but also an element of human empathy on your side in a way to identify with the individuals who are living these lives.
Yeah, in some ways it's some of the rules of acting, you know, I mean, in terms of internalizing a character, but just doing it in reverse. And, you know, whether it's Armenian arms dealers or washed-up mafioso or television executives or former radicals or whomever. You know, everybody has their place and perspective in the world. And that's been very useful in getting people to talk and share information. It also brings, if you're in the media business, unfortunately this isn't taught that much, it also means a certain personal responsibility.
Well, on that note, Lowell, I thank you very much for taking this time being with us. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.